In 1977, on a small island in northern Brazil, something began descending from the night sky. Residents of Colares reported beams of light entering their homes. They described burns, sudden weakness, small puncture marks on their skin. They gave it a name, chupa chupa. In most cases, stories like this remain rumors. But this time, the state did not dismiss them. The military government deployed the Brazilian Air Force. Officers arrived with cameras, notebooks, and field equipment. They photographed the sky, interviewed witnesses, filed hundreds of pages of reports. For months, the phenomenon was treated as operationally real. Then, the operation ended. No public explanation. No final classification. The files were archived. This is not a story about aliens. It is a story about what happens when a government investigates harm and cannot define it. For a brief moment in the Amazon, the state looked up and had no answer. 1977. Brazil was not a fragile state at the time. It was under a consolidated military regime that had governed the country since 1964. Institutions were centralized. Information flowed through controlled channels. Public disorder was not tolerated. The state projected strength. Censorship existed. Surveillance existed. Intelligence structures operated quietly but efficiently. In this environment, narratives were not allowed to spiral uncontrollably, which makes what happened in the Amazon that year structurally unusual. In the northern state of Pará, far from Brasilia's administrative core, small riverside communities began reporting nocturnal disturbances, lights descending from the sky, focused beams, physical symptoms. Under most governments, especially those concerned with stability, such reports might be dismissed publicly as rumor, superstition, or hysteria. But 1977 was also the late Cold War. Airspace mattered. Unidentified aerial phenomena, even if unlikely to be hostile aircraft, could not be casually ignored. Military regimes are particularly sensitive to anything that suggests territorial vulnerability. This is a key detail. The reports did not emerge in a democratic environment where open debate amplified them. They surfaced under an authoritarian system built on narrative control. And yet, instead of silencing the claims, the government escalated them institutionally. This reveals something about the nature of state authority. Authoritarian control works best when threats are definable. Political opposition can be categorized. Criminal activity can be prosecuted. Foreign intrusion can be militarily addressed. But phenomena that do not immediately fit into existing categories create a different type of pressure. Not because they are necessarily dangerous, but because they are undefined. In 1977, Brazil was experiencing gradual political abertura, a slow, controlled process of easing repression. The regime was attempting to transition without appearing weak. An unexplained phenomenon affecting civilians introduced an unpredictable variable. If dismissed too quickly, the state risked appearing indifferent. If exaggerated, it risked generating panic. If misclassified, it risked exposing institutional blind spots. So the question in 1977 was not whether something extraordinary was happening. The question was how a government built on control would respond when confronted with reports that did not fit its vocabulary of threat. That response would become known as Operação Prato, and it would show that even centralized authority has procedural limits when faced with the unknown. To understand Operação Prato, you have to understand geography. Colares is not an urban center. It is a small estuarine island located near the Baía do Marajo in the state of Pará, northern Brazil. In the 1970s, it was even more isolated than it is today. Wooden houses, fishing-based economy, limited electricity, minimal medical infrastructure. At night, darkness was complete. This matters. In large cities, artificial light reshapes perception. In Colares, the sky dominated the environment. The horizon was open. Visibility extended over water and mangrove-lined shores. Any luminous phenomenon would stand out immediately. But geography also shaped vulnerability. Medical access was limited. Communication with larger urban centers was slow. Rumors, when they spread, moved through close-knit social networks, families, fishermen, neighbors. Beginning in mid-1977, residents started describing similar nocturnal encounters. Beams of light entering homes through windows or thatched openings. Individuals reportedly immobilized by intense brightness. After effects including fatigue, dizziness, small burns, and puncture-like marks. The phenomenon acquired a local name, chupa chupa. The term was descriptive rather than ideological, suggesting something that sucked energy or blood. It reflected how residents interpreted physical symptoms, not necessarily what they believed the source to be. Reports were not confined to a single household. Multiple families described comparable sequences: appearance of light, brief exposure, physical consequence. Fear began altering behavior. Some residents slept outdoors in groups. Others avoided isolated areas after sunset. Community routines adjusted around darkness. Importantly, Colares was not socially chaotic. It was structured, small, and interdependent. That structure made patterns noticeable. When dozens of people describe variations of the same event within a limited geographic space, authorities face a classification dilemma. Is it environmental? Is it psychological? Is it criminal? Is it atmospheric? The island's isolation amplified both the phenomenon and the uncertainty around it. Because Colares was surrounded by water and mangrove channels, conventional explanations like organized external attack were difficult to conceptualize. There were no signs of forced entry, no aircraft noise consistent with known military craft, no visible machinery. At the same time, the openness of the landscape meant there were few physical barriers to observation. Whatever was happening was not concealed by dense urban infrastructure. This combination, isolation, visibility, and repeated testimony, transformed Colares from a remote island into a procedural problem. Geography did not prove the phenomenon, but it prevented easy dismissal. And that was enough to trigger institutional attention. When reports from Colares intensified, the Brazilian government did not respond with a press release. It responded with deployment. The Brazilian Air Force initiated what became known as Operação Prato, a structured investigative mission led by military personnel. The operation was not symbolic. Officers were physically sent to the region, equipment was transported, observation posts were established. This detail is critical. The state did not outsource the matter to local police. It did not classify it as mere rumor. It treated the phenomenon as operationally relevant. Military teams conducted interviews with residents. They documented testimonies systematically. Names, dates, times, physical symptoms. Field notes were compiled. Sketches were produced based on witness descriptions. Photographic equipment was used during nighttime surveillance. Officers attempted to capture luminous phenomena on film. Reports indicate that dozens of images were collected, alongside written descriptions of observed aerial lights. The language in the files, later partially declassified, is restrained. There is no speculative terminology, no official endorsement of extraordinary conclusions. Instead, the documentation reflects procedural discipline: observation, recording, archiving. Some reports referenced medical symptoms described by civilians: fatigue, small lesions, temporary weakness. The military did not publicly validate these as caused by any defined source, but they were recorded. This distinction matters. Recording is not the same as confirming, but recording implies institutional acknowledgement. For months, the operation continued. Night watches were conducted. Teams remained in the region. Communication flowed back to command structures. And then, without dramatic announcement, the operation ended. No press conference explained findings. No definitive technical classification was released. No hostile actor was identified. The mission was closed administratively. Years later, portions of the documentation became accessible to the public. The files confirmed that the investigation was real and extensive. They also confirmed something equally important. The state had collected data, but it had not produced a conclusion. Operação Prato did not escalate into a national crisis. It did not transform into public panic. It was contained within bureaucratic channels. The Air Force had fulfilled its procedural obligation: investigate, document, assess. What it could not do was translate the phenomenon into a stable category. And in institutional systems, what cannot be categorized often becomes archived. Not denied, not explained, stored. Investigations are designed to produce outcomes: a report, a classification, a cause. Operação Prato produced documentation, but not definition. After months of field presence, night observations, interviews, and compiled material, the mission was formally closed. There was no dramatic announcement, no public technical briefing, no identified threat. The operation simply ended. This is where the institutional tension becomes visible. When a government investigates harm reported by civilians, it typically resolves the disturbance in one of three ways. It identifies a culprit, it reframes the event as misinterpretation, or it categorizes the phenomenon within existing scientific language. In Colares, none of those occurred publicly. The phenomenon was neither officially confirmed nor definitively dismissed. The files were archived. Years later, partial declassification confirmed something subtle but important. The state had taken the reports seriously enough to document them extensively. Photographs, sketches, testimonies, operational notes, hundreds of pages. But nowhere in those materials does a final, stabilizing conclusion appear. No atmospheric phenomenon formally declared, no criminal activity formally identified, no foreign incursion formally recognized. Silence in this case was not denial. It was administrative containment. This distinction matters. Denial would have required public contradiction. Containment required procedural closure. By ending the operation without explanation, the state neutralized escalation. The phenomenon was absorbed into archives rather than amplified into national crisis. The reports faded from headlines. The island returned to routine. The military shifted focus. In institutional systems, what cannot be conclusively defined often does not become controversy. It becomes a file. Operação Prato did not end with revelation. It ended with storage. And sometimes silence is not the absence of information, but the final form of it. States are designed to classify. They define threats. They assign causes. They stabilize narratives. This is not merely bureaucratic preference. It is structural necessity. Authority depends on interpretability. The government must be able to say what something is in order to decide what to do about it. Operação Prato exposed a narrow but important boundary. The Brazilian military government of 1977 was not weak. It controlled media. It managed dissent. It possessed armed capacity and centralized intelligence. Yet in Colares, it encountered reports that did not fit pre-existing categories of insurgency, crime, foreign aggression, or natural disaster. And when classification becomes uncertain, authority shifts from explanation to procedure. The Air Force investigated. It documented. It archived. But it did not transform the phenomenon into a stable conclusion. This is the structural limit. Institutions can investigate beyond their understanding, but they cannot communicate beyond their vocabulary. When a disturbance cannot be clearly named, two risks emerge. If the state overreaches, it legitimizes speculation. If it dismisses prematurely, it undermines credibility. Operação Prato navigated between those risks by choosing administrative containment. The event was neither elevated into national alarm nor erased from record. It was absorbed. That absorption is revealing. The phenomenon eventually faded, whether due to natural cessation, shifting perception, or altered attention. What remained was documentation without definition. For a brief moment, civilians described harm. The military responded with discipline, and the system reached the edge of its explanatory capacity. Not collapse, not chaos, a boundary. The state can control territory. It can regulate speech. It can deploy force. But even centralized authority depends on one fragile element: the ability to say what something is. In Colares, that certainty never arrived. And when certainty does not arrive, institutions do what they are built to do. They close the file. The lights eventually stopped, or at least the reports did. Colares did not disappear. The island remained where it had always been, surrounded by water, mangroves, and open sky. Fishing continued. Houses stood. Night still fell the same way it always had. Operação Prato became a closed chapter. The military government that authorized the investigation would itself fade within a decade, replaced by a gradual return to civilian rule. Institutions shifted. Leadership changed. Archives remained. And inside those archives, hundreds of pages documented a moment when the state confronted something it could not fully translate. No official declaration of extraterrestrial contact, no confirmed hostile aircraft, no definitive atmospheric anomaly, just procedure. This is what makes the case enduring. Not the lights, not the speculation, not the mythology that later formed around it, but the posture. For a brief period in 1977, under a regime defined by control and narrative management, civilian reports triggered a formal military response. The phenomenon was treated seriously enough to mobilize resources, structured enough to generate files, significant enough to warrant attention, and yet insufficiently defined to produce closure. In institutional terms, that is rare. States prefer resolution. Even an incorrect explanation can restore order. A labeled event is manageable. An undefined one lingers at the edge of authority. Colares did not destabilize Brazil. It did not provoke national panic. It did not escalate into open crisis. It simply reached a boundary. A moment when centralized power looked upward toward a dark Amazon sky and found nothing it could confidently name. The investigation ended. The file was stored. The sky remained. And sometimes the most revealing part of a story is not what was discovered, but what could not be said.